All right, so let's dive right in. We're taking a trip back to 17th and 18th century British North America today.
It's exciting.
Oh, it is. And we've got some excerpts from the American Yawp to guide us. It's not going to be just dates and battles and all that.
Right. Yeah.
We're going deeper. Like, how did slavery shape society? How did stuff happening in London affect people across the ocean? Those ripple effects.
Fascinating period.
It is. And we'll see how decisions made by the colonists set the stage for both, well, harmony and conflict.
Yeah, the seeds of so much later history.
Exactly. For example, have you ever heard of the walking purchase? It was this land deal where they basically said, okay, we'll take as much land as a man can walk in a certain amount of time.
Interesting.
But of course, there's a catch. We'll get to that later. Oh, and the story of Rose Davis.
What-
It'll make you think about how fragile freedom was back then, especially if you weren't, the right kind of person.
I bet that resonates with a lot of folks even today.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the Middle Passage. We'll discuss the horrors, of course, but also how it's still impacting American culture today.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so to set the stage, imagine British North America as part of this huge Atlantic network. You've got European powers fighting for control, Native American societies facing massive changes.
It's a world in flux.
Totally. And right there, the seeds of race-based slavery are being sown.
Yeah, that's a turning point in history.
Now, you might think the mainland colonies were the big players, but actually, the Caribbean was where the real money was being made.
The Sugar Islands.
Right. But here's the thing. Decisions made in London, like imagine a law being passed thousands of miles away.
And it affects you directly.
Yeah. Like the Navigation Act of 1651, which had a huge impact on the colonies. It really shows how connected everything was back then.
It's amazing how those ripples traveled.
Right. So let's talk about race-based slavery.
It's a difficult topic.
Absolutely, and disturbing. But we gotta face it head on. The 1660s was a turning point, especially in Virginia and Barbados.
Things got codified, right?
Exactly. Laws were passed that made enslavement of Africans for life, like official. And it wasn't just about labor anymore, it was about establishing a strict racial hierarchy.
A system built on, well, oppression.
Yeah. And you see this in the story of Rose Davis. She was a woman of mixed race in Virginia, and at first she was classified as white.
Oh?
But then, get this, she was later declared legally black
Oh, wow.
and forced into servitude. Her story just shows how easily manipulated those racial categories were, especially when it benefited the powerful.
Chilling example.
It really makes you think, how much of this was about economics versus actual belief in racial superiority?
Yeah, was it prejudice or profit?
Or both.
Right. And alongside all of this, you've got the Native American slave trade happening at the same time.
It's often forgotten, but it was huge.
So huge. We're talking tens of thousands of Native Americans captured and enslaved, often through wars that were, instigated by the colonists.
And then they profited from selling the captives.
Brutal.
It's a really dark chapter. And the shift from Native American to African slavery, it wasn't random. Part of it was wanting a workforce that was considered more reliable, less likely to escape or rebel.
I see.
So basically, as demand for labor grew, they turned to a system that, well, allowed for even greater control and dehumanization.
Makes you think about the roots of racism in the Americas.
For sure. Now, we can't talk about slavery without addressing the Middle Passage.
Yeah, one of the most horrific chapters in human history.
We have these accounts like Olaudah Equiano. He describes the unimaginable suffering on those slave ships. The filth, the disease, the cruelty. It's hard to even comprehend.
It's hard to read, hard to imagine.
And Equiano's narrative, it shows the resilience of the human spirit, but also lays bare the calculated cruelty of the whole system. Millions died during those voyages, treated as cargo.
Just awful. Millions of lives lost.
It's almost impossible to grasp the scale. 11 to 12 million Africans transported across the Atlantic, with millions more dying in the process, and yet there's this enduring cultural impact.
Yeah, that's the complex part of the legacy.
Right. The forced migration of Africans, it brought a fusion of languages, music, foodways, traditions, things that still shape American culture today.
It's a reminder that even amidst suffering, the human spirit finds ways to create and leave its mark.
It's incredibly powerful and at the same time so tragic that those expressions were born out of such a brutal system.
It's a lot to grapple with.
It is. So while all this is happening in the colonies, England itself is going through some major drama.
Oh yeah, the English Civil War.
A bloody conflict full of religious and political tension.
And it wasn't just contained to England, right? It affected the colonies too.
Oh, absolutely. We have to remember these weren't just isolated events. The colonies were deeply connected to what was going on back in England.
Makes sense.
So when Parliament wins the war, they want to, tighten their grip on the colonies.
Consolidate their power.
Exactly. They enact policies like the Navigation Act of 1651, restricting colonial trade, basically saying you can only ship goods on English vessels and through English ports.
So it's like, even after a civil war, they're still trying to control the colonies.
Yeah, it's this constant tension between colonial autonomy and imperial control, a theme we'll see play out again and again. Then you have the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, followed by his successor James II, who's openly Catholic,
Uh-oh, that probably didn't go over well.
especially in those Protestant-dominated colonies. It caused some serious anxiety. James's Catholicism and his pro-French leanings, they set the stage for what we know as the Glorious Revolution.
A revolution with a fancy name.
Right, and this revolution had huge implications for both England and its colonies. But we'll have to save that story for next time.
Cliffhanger.
I know, right? So we've laid the groundwork, the complex world of trade, slavery, and political turmoil in early British North America. But trust me, things are about to get even more interesting.
I'm ready for part 2.
You and me both. We'll see you then.
Looking forward to it.
Last time, we left off with James II sitting on that throne and all those religious and political tensions like simmering. So what happened with this glorious revolution thing?
Well, in 1688, things finally boiled over. James II, with his Catholicism and those pro-French policies, he'd alienated a big chunk of England.
Right.
So they deposed him,
Oh, just like that.
and they replaced him with his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange.
Okay, so basically a family drama turned political coup. Did the colonies just sit back and watch?
Well, not exactly. Remember, they were still under English rule, so any big shift in power back home was going to affect them. But they didn't all react the same way. Some colonies, like Virginia, they were more cautious.
Makes sense. They'd been pretty loyal to the crown during that whole English Civil War thing.
Right. They didn't want to rock the boat and lose favor with the new monarchs.
Yeah.
But other colonies, especially up in New England, they saw opportunity knocking.
I bet they did.
They'd been more supportive of Parliament. So they saw this as a win for their own ideas about religious freedom and self-governance.
That's where the glorious part really comes in for them, right? A win for Protestantism and a chance to take more control.
Exactly. Some colonies, like Massachusetts, they even used the chaos to overthrow their own colonial governments and get closer to those new Protestant monarchs.
Wow, so an event happening thousands of miles away sparks local uprisings. It's crazy how connected everything was.
Yeah, it really shows how the Atlantic world was all intertwined. Ideas, events, they all traveled back and forth. Something in London could set off a chain reaction in Boston or Charlestown. But amidst all that political drama, there were big changes happening within the colonies themselves, too. New settlements popping up.
Right. It's like this burst of expansion, trying out different ways of life.
You've got Maryland, started as a haven for Catholics, but quickly becoming Protestant-dominated, kind of mirroring what was happening in England. Then there's Connecticut and Rhode Island, each with their own take on religious freedom.
Yeah, Connecticut with its slightly less strict Puritanism than Massachusetts.
Right. And Rhode Island, wow, they went all out.
Didn't they abolish witchcraft trials and stuff?
Yeah, and imprisonment for debt, even chattel slavery, way before other colonies even thought about it.
They were way ahead of their time.
They were a haven for folks looking to escape persecution. Quakers, Jews, all sorts of dissenting Protestants.
And then there's New York, going from Dutch, New Netherland to English control. That couldn't have been easy.
Yeah, definitely a culture clash there. But even with the English takeover, that Dutch influence remained strong. They weren't so quick to assimilate.
So even with the change in power, the old culture sticks around. It's like a microcosm of that whole cultural mixing happening in the colonies.
Absolutely. Then you've got New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas being founded, each one with its own story, driven by, well, a mix of things: politics, economics, religious freedom. Speaking of which, William Penn's vision for Pennsylvania was pretty unique.
Oh, yeah, his Quaker beliefs. He wanted peace, especially with the Native Americans.
He insisted on buying land from them, not just taking it by force. Radical for the time.
Makes you wonder how things would have been different if more colonies had done that.
It's a good question. But honestly, the desire for land and profit often won out. Like with the Carolinas.
Slavery baked right into their economy.
It shows the contradictions in colonialism, right?
Yeah.
Some folks wanted religious freedom or peaceful coexistence, but others were driven by greed and that belief in their own superiority.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us to another big theme, violence. As the colonies expanded, conflict was almost inevitable.
Whether between colonists and Native Americans or even within colonial society itself.
Right, we can't ignore that darker side. We've got the Pequot War, King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion, the Pueblo Revolt. It's a pretty violent era.
Yeah, lots of upheaval.
Let's start with the Pequot War, a prime example of how brutal things could get. What was it all about?
Well, the Pequot War up in New England in the 1630s, it was basically a fight for land, resources, and power.
Classic recipe for conflict.
The Pequot, they'd been a powerful tribe, but English expansion was squeezing them, and they had competition from other Native American groups,
So all boiled over.
and led to the Mystic Massacre. English forces and their Narragansett allies attacked a Pequot village, set it on fire, killed hundreds, men, women, children.
That's horrifying.
A brutal act of retaliation, and it basically destroyed the Pequot as a major power.
It's a side of colonialism that we don't always hear about, but it's important to remember.
And the violence didn't end there. A few decades later, you have King Philip's War, an even bigger conflict.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Engulfed all of New England in violence?
It was a pan-Indian uprising, led by the Wampanoag leader, Metacom, the English called him King Philip. He managed to unite several tribes against the colonists.
Wow, so he brought different tribes together.
It was a huge challenge to the English. The fighting lasted over a year, lots of death and destruction on both sides.
And it must have left deep scars on the region.
Oh, absolutely. The brutality, the trauma, it shattered the fragile peace and really deepened the divide between colonists and Native Americans.
Okay, so you've got these devastating wars in New England. And then down in Virginia, you have Bacon's Rebellion. That one always struck me as interesting because it was about more than just fighting against the colonial authorities.
Right. It also exposed the tensions between the elite planters and the poorer settlers.
Exactly. It wasn't just about Native Americans. It was about class and power within the colony itself.
It was a mix of things. Resentment over land, lack of political representation, and this feeling that the government wasn't protecting them from Native American attacks.
So basically, they felt ignored and exploited by their own leaders.
Yeah, and the spark that set it all off. A dispute over stolen pigs.
You're kidding.
It's amazing how something so small can turn into a full-blown rebellion.
So these stolen pigs led to raids, counter-raids, and eventually open conflict between Nathaniel Bacon and Governor William Berkeley.
Berkeley, he represented the elite. He wanted to keep the peace with the Native Americans and focus on the tobacco trade.
But Bacon, he was like the champion of the common man.
Right, accusing Berkeley of corruption, saying he cared more about the rich than the safety of ordinary people. It was the haves against the have-nots, with Native Americans caught in the middle.
So what happened? Did Bacon win?
Well, the rebellion was put down. Bacon died during the conflict, dysentery I think it was, and his followers were either captured or gave up.
So the established order won, but not without a fight.
Exactly. Bacon's rebellion didn't change things overnight, but it exposed those cracks in colonial society. Those tensions were going to keep simmering.
It shows that the path to American independence was messy and complicated. Lots of internal conflicts, different ideas about what the colonies should be.
And it wasn't just the English colonies facing these challenges. The Spanish had their share of resistance too. Remember the Pueblo Revolt of 1680?
Oh yeah, that's a story of incredible resilience. What led to that? Who were the main players? What were they fighting for?
The Pueblo Revolt was a huge act of resistance against the Spanish in what's now New Mexico.
Okay.
The Pueblo people had endured decades of oppression under the Spanish. Forced labor, religious conversion, suppression of their culture.
So they were fighting for their very identity.
Right. The Spanish wanted to erase Pueblo culture and force them to assimilate. It's something we see a lot in colonial history.
That urge to control not just land and resources, but minds and beliefs as well.
Exactly. But the Pueblo people pushed back against that. The rebellion was led by a Pueblo religious leader named Pope. The Spanish had imprisoned and whipped him for practicing his traditional faith.
So he had a personal stake in this fight.
And he became this charismatic leader, uniting different Pueblo groups who usually didn't get along. They launched a coordinated attack, drove the Spanish out, destroyed their churches, and reclaimed their land.
It's amazing they pulled that off. How long did they stay free?
12 years. It was a remarkable feat of resistance. It shows how determined they were to preserve their culture and autonomy.
But I guess the Spanish came back eventually.
They did, but things weren't the same. They had to be more careful. The Pueblo Revolt had shown them that even powerful empires weren't invincible.
So even though it was a temporary victory, it had a lasting impact.
It inspired other indigenous groups to resist too. A reminder that even when the odds seem impossible, resistance is always possible. So we've seen these explosions of violence in New England, the internal divisions of Bacon's Rebellion, and the successful, though temporary, overthrow of Spanish rule in the Pueblo Revolt. Conflict was everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was woven into colonial life. But these weren't just isolated events. They were all connected to bigger forces like the expansion of European empires, the slave trade, and the fight for land and resources.
And it wasn't just colonists versus Native Americans, right? You had conflict between the European powers themselves, like England and
Right,
France.
that rivalry was a huge factor. They were fighting for dominance all over the world, and that fight spilled over to the colonies, leading to what we know as the French and Indian War.
A war that would change everything.
It's a conflict that's often overlooked, but it was a major turning point in North American history. It set the stage for the American Revolution and the birth of the United States.
So we're about to enter another exciting chapter in our deep dive.
We are. The French and Indian War, that's what we'll pick up next time.
So last time we were talking about all those colonial conflicts, King Philip's War, the Pueblo Revolt, and now we're getting to this major showdown, the French and Indian War.
A clash of empires.
Right, and it often gets overshadowed by the Revolution, but you said it was a turning point.
It really was. The French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War if we're talking globally, it was Great Britain and France fighting for control, not just in North America, but all over.
Wow, so the stakes were high, and it wasn't just those European powers duking it out, right? Native Americans were involved too.
Absolutely. Lots of Native American tribes got pulled into the conflict, each one trying to figure out the best move for themselves. Some sided with the French, hoping to protect their land and their trading relationships.
They were playing the game too, trying to survive.
Exactly. Others, like the Iroquois Confederacy, they tried to stay neutral at first, but eventually joined the British side. Their decisions had a big impact on how the war played out.
So they weren't just bystanders, they were shaping events.
Right, and a lot of it came down to the Ohio Valley. Fertile land, access to waterways, it was strategically vital.
Whoever controlled that valley controlled North America.
Pretty much. Early on, the French and their Native American allies had the upper hand. They had forts, trading posts, and they were good at guerrilla warfare.
Hit and run tactics.
But as the war went on, the British started pouring in more resources, more troops. The tide began to turn.
And wasn't this the war where George Washington got his start?
It was. He was young, in his 20s, started as a surveyor, then led a Virginia militia. He had some setbacks, some defeats, but it was all valuable experience that would come in handy later during the Revolution.
So the war that solidified British control also trained the future leaders of the rebellion against that control. History is full of ironies.
It is. And while the British won in the end, it came at a cost. The war was expensive, and to pay for it, they started imposing new taxes on the colonies.
Oh yeah, that didn't go over well.
Not at all. The most famous one was the Stamp Act of 1665. Colonists had to pay a tax on any printed material.
Newspapers, legal documents, everything.
It sparked huge protests. No taxation without representation. That was their rallying cry.
Because they didn't have elected representatives in Parliament.
Right, so they saw it as a violation of their rights.
So the war that was supposed to make the British Empire stronger actually weakened it. It's like they won but lost at the same time.
You could say that. The war also led to tighter control over colonial trade and government, which just made the colonists more resentful and wanting more autonomy.
It's a chain reaction. The French and Indian War, this global conflict, sets off events that lead to the American Revolution.
It shows how connected everything is. History isn't just a straight line. It's a web of interconnected events, each one shaping the next.
And it's not just about battles and treaties, it's about people. People like Rose Davis, who had her freedom taken away by a system built on exploitation. Or Oloda Equiano, who survived the horrors of the Middle Passage and had the courage to tell his story. And all those Native Americans fighting to hold on to their cultures, their way of life.
You're right. We've seen the triumphs and the tragedies, the good and the bad, all the complexities of this era, how events, big and small, shaped individuals, communities, whole nations.
And those events still matter today. They make us think about the legacy of colonialism, the meaning of freedom, the fight for justice and equality.
Absolutely. This deep dive, it's just a glimpse into the past, but it's a past that still shapes our world today.
And if you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out The American Yawp. It's a great resource for anyone who wants to dig deeper into this fascinating period in American history.
A period full of contradictions and complexities.
And as you learn and explore, keep asking questions, keep making those connections, keep diving deep.
Until next time.